Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be talking about how we can rethink the way we play the Eldari. So, this is something that when the Codex came out, I was really excited to talk about. But I found myself getting wrapped into conventional ways of thinking when it came to how to play the codex, how to use the units, how to use the detachments, what units to include in said attachments, and so forth. And I think I've, especially as of late, gotten kind of wrapped up in talking about quote unquote the meta. And I want to kind of take a break away from that for a second because although I do think that understanding the meta is important to the broader knowledge of the game and the broader knowledge of, your experiences in 40K and all of our experiences, really, I don't think it's always helpful as a mindset. Because one thing that playing the Eldari has taught me over the years is to expect the unexpected and to be unconventional. And that unconventionality is actually one of the greatest tools at our disposal for not only winning games, but having a better Warhammer 40K experience in general. So, without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right in and let's explore rethinking the way we play the Eldari. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the conventional Eldari wisdom regarding playstyle. The wisdom that every Eldari player is bestowed upon them when they start the faction and what most people think about it. We're going to be talking about rethinking detachment bias, which is something that we haven't had to deal with in past editions, but since we've had, detachments in 10th edition, it is something that is heavily influencing our thought process. So we're going to rethink that a little bit. We're also going to be talking about armies of opportunity and counting cards and what they have to do with the Eldari. And lastly, the eternal curse of the Eldari and how it relates to how we think about the army. So first, let us go ahead and talk about the standard conventional Eldari wisdom regarding the faction's playstyle. Now, as you guys know, and as anybody will tell you, not just Eldari players, the Eldar are typically seen as a fast, utility-based faction with a focus on scoring and precision. In 10th edition specifically, this is how they're generally described. They are, in a lot of ways, the fastest faction in the game, in that they can, basically have units that can move really, really fast across the board in a single activation. Warp Spiders are the fastest unit in the game, bar none. They move 24 inches and they can move up to 26 and sometimes even 27 inches, depending on detachment. And that is by and far the fastest unit in the game. They can also, of course, move through ruins and move through other models and so forth. There is no doubt that the Eldari have the fastest units in the game. There's also no doubt that we have plenty of utility units for scoring objectives and, general purpose move blocking, screening purposes. And there is also no doubt that we are a precision faction. We are filled with units that are very good against a specific type of target, aka Aspect Warriors. Aspect Warriors typically provide the specialized damage and utility that the faction is generally known for. Outcasts and Guardians are typically cheaper, more expendable units meant for scoring and other utility purposes like screening. And Wraiths are the durability side of the Eldari, although we know that the Wraiths historically haven't been that strong. And when they have been strong, it's been a little too strong, as noted in the index, when most of the Wraith units, Wraith Guard, Wraith Knights, and stuff like that, were just really powerful. Now, this is the conventional Eldari wisdom regarding the faction. But I would also like to intercede here and say that the conventional knowledge is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the faction. The faction is actually much deeper than this, and the faction itself represents not only speed, not only scoring and precision, but unconventionality and being able to score and, kind of circumvent normal expectations of how a faction or, set of units or an army, I should say, behaves on the battlefield. And one of the ways in which I think we can start kind of repurposing and rethinking the way we design our armies is by rethinking detachment bias. So this is something that I fell into quite early on when the Codex came out, because you look at a detachment, you figure out what's strong in it, there's some obvious choices that, come to your mind, and you just kind of play those units. And because they work so well, and because our thoughts are kind of, I guess you could say they're confirmed by competitive players who run lists filled with the same type of units that we think are, conventionally good in these detachments, we have a little bit of confirmation bias when it comes to this. So, for example, Warhost and Aspect Host are both detachments that are seen as very aggressive. They're super aggro detachments. Now, who thought of this as an aggressive detachment? Who was the first person who came up with it? Well, the Eldari community kind of just saw this and thought, wow, boom, right? What do these detachments have in common? They're both very fast. They both allow units to punch up against heavier targets, and they're very straightforward, right? Aspect Host and Warhost share ways to get multiple activations with damage dealing units like Fire Dragons or Dire Avengers or Dark Reapers, etc. Both detachments also have damage boosting capabilities. The differences are that Warhost is a little faster and more utility based, whereas Aspect Host is more centered towards damage. On the other hand, Seer Council and Guardian Battle Host are seen as the more defensive detachments because of the stratagems and typically the unit selection that we see with these lists. With Seer Council, we do see Aspect Warriors, but they're being used in a more defensive manner most of the time, or in some cases, they're being kind of thought of more like, big, massive units that can benefit from the buffs that Seer Council can provide, and they are protected by defensive stratagems. Guardian Battle Host is very similar. We see a lot of the stratagems in both of these detachments as extremely defensive. Things like Ish's Fury in Seer Council, or, in Guardian Battle Host, we have Victory, I think it's called Victory at All Costs, or At All Costs, where you can revive Guardian units, and you can revive the Guardian models within those units. Again, these are seen as more defensive type stratagems that up the durability of these units versus shooting, right? In Seer Council, we also have a stratagem called Psychic Shield, which gives a unit 18-inch loan up. However, I do think, now having played all of these detachments dozens of times, that thinking about the detachments in this way is actually an oversimplification that can prevent players from considering certain builds or choices in their games. And I think it's one of the reasons why we see so much of a disconnect or a, kind of wide gap, if you will, between the units people use and the units people do not use and how often they're used. So, for example, right, Aspect Warriors are extremely popular. We see Aspect Warriors in pretty much every single detachment, with the exception of Guardian Battle Host and maybe Harlequins and Spirit Conclave, right? But in most detachments, we see Aspect Warriors. And that goes back, I think, to the conventional wisdom that we've all been talking about for ages and ages and ages as Eldari players that Eldar are all about the speed and the precision. And aspect warriors really embody this, right? So a lot of times when we see units that aren't aspect warriors, we often compare them to aspect warriors and we ask ourselves the question, can this unit do what an aspect warrior unit does? And oftentimes the answer is no, right? If you look at a lot of the units, like let's take Shroud Runners, for example. Shroud Runners are actually a very good unit, but a lot of times we don't consider Shroud Runners as a good substitute for other aspect units that do a very similar thing. Move blockers or units like Swooping Hawks, for example, are very similar to Shroud Runners. But we oftentimes prefer Swooping Hawks because they embody that Eldar feel much better in that they're a little tiny bit more precise because they can deal some more wounds, of course, and they're a tiny bit faster in some cases because walls prevent Shroud Runners from being able to move fully through them. However, what we're not realizing here is that Shroud Runners have strengths of their own that could be useful in games and could be useful in certain builds, regardless of the detachment. And in some detachments, they're actually really powerful because they can, be buffed by certain stratagems or abilities. The other thing is that both Aspect Host and War Host, Seer Council, and Guardian Battle Host are seen, right? Aspect Host and War Host are seen as aggressive. Seer Council and Guardian Battle Host are seen as defensive and are built accordingly. But weirdly enough, both Aspect Host and War Host have defensive abilities, as do, most armies, by the way. Most armies that have aggressive detachments also have defensive abilities and units within those detachments. Aspect Host and War Host are the very same way. We do see defensive stratagems within them. We see Skyborn Sanctuary. Now, Skyborn Sanctuary is an extremely defensive stratagem. It's one of the best defensive stratagems, I would say, in the game for units that want to come out of a transport. And yes, you do have to invest in a transport, of course. You do have to pay the command points, but it is a very good defensive stratagem because it keeps a unit relatively safe from a lot of different things. Both of these detachments have that. Warhost takes it a step further and also has lightning fast reactions, -1 to hit. So even though these detachments are considered aggressive, quote unquote, they have defensive stratagems within them, and I would even say that a lot of the strength of Aspect Host and Warhost come from the way that they can, repeat or get multiple activations out of the same unit, aka defensive style stratagems. Seer Council and Guardian Battle Host, as I said before, are seen as the more defensive detachments. But both of those detachments actually have a lot of tools to play extremely aggressively if you wish it. Seer Council, of course, can teleport a unit anywhere it wants to outside of 9 inches of enemy units. This can be extremely powerful and can be used extremely aggressively to get an upper hand early in the game. Now, it won't always work, but it is, at the end of the day, a pretty aggressive stratagem in some cases. Seer Council also has Ish's Fury, which seems defensive. If an enemy walks within 9 inches of you, you can do mortal wounds. However, what we don't keep in mind is that we can also provoke situations where an opponent might not be able to move a unit because they are within 9 inches of a psyker. Again, this can be used aggressively. This can be used with, one of the best and cheapest psykers in the Codex, the Warlock Skyrunner. The Warlock Skyrunner can move up quickly, get into a position near a lone operative, for example, that has maybe 3-4 wounds, and on average dice, you will be able to kill it. So your opponent might not want to risk moving that lone operative now, which again can be really effective. We also have access to very aggressive units in Seer Council. Aspect Warriors, of course. Things like Fire Dragons, which can be very powerful. Even striking Scorpions, if seen in a certain light in a Seer Council list, can be extremely powerful because of the fact that you can give them -1 to hit and wound in close combat. And Guardian Battle Host has a lot of aggressive stratagems. A stratagem that allows a Storm Guardian unit to auto advance 6, shoot, and then charge an opponent from across the board. But not only that, also gives you access to infiltrating Storm Guardians via an enhancement. And of course, as we know, we can attach different things to Storm Guardians. We can attach Warlocks to Storm Guardians so that they can flamer something. Really powerful flamer attacks with Destructor. Or an Autarch with Breath of Vol to allow you to reroll your flamer attacks and your fusion gun damage rolls. So, again, even though the conventional wisdom is that Aspect Host and War Host are more aggressive, and Seer Council and Guardian Battle Host are more defensive, oftentimes you can play them in the exact opposite manner if you wish to do so. And I would argue that a lot of the inbuilt strategy of these detachments requires both to be truly successful on the battlefield. And lastly, of course, the matchup can change the way any Aeldari list will play on the battlefield, right? There's some matchups, for example, where an Aspect Host list or a War Host list won't want to push up all of their units at once. They're not going to want to go for the first or second turn Alpha Strike and destroy half your opponent's army. I've seen this a lot come up in competitive discords as well as among the community at large, that Aspect Host and War Host are the army that just deletes the enemy army in one single turn. Turn 2, after you stage up, you're going to just delete most of your opponent's army, and that's game. The reality is, this isn't always the case. It's very matchup dependent. Now, if your opponent makes mistakes in their positioning and they're not able to stop your Eldar units from coming in, and they don't, have the foresight to figure out ways to, kind of defeat that strategy, then of course that's possible. But at the same time, I've played against good opponents in many a game who do not allow this to happen. And usually games go on till turn 4 until we can, kind of figure out if we're going to finish the game or not, right? Because sometimes it's just a matter of, am I going to draw better secondaries than you or not? It's that close, right? So a lot of games that I've played with my Aspect Host list do go on the full amount of turns because my opponent is a good player, but also because the matchup is not immediately favorable towards me just jumping in there all at once and trying to table my opponent. It's just not possible, right? So that's also a thing, right? So I think the conventional wisdom that these detachments are very focused toward one way of playing is actually a little bit, I guess we could say, limiting to our perspective of how the Eldar should play on the battlefield, and also to us as players who want to improve our game and to improve our understanding of how 40k works. Not just the Eldari, but 40k in general. Now, I want to talk about one more thing before I bring up the last point, and that is the Eldar as an army of opportunity and the art of counting cards. So I've talked about this before in brief, but I don't think I've ever fully explained what I mean by these two things. So first of all, the Eldari as a faction in 10th edition are an army of what I like to call faded opportunity. Something I kind of came up with today, to be honest. I've always thought of them as an army of opportunity in 10th edition, but I want to call it faded opportunity because it's something that we bring into being, right? In that you must, as the player, create the very situations you wish to exploit. So, using warp spiders to move block your opponent only works if you are able to get into a position to move block effectively, right? We are creating the very situation we wish to exploit. But we're not always going to want to use warp spiders like this because certain opponents may not actually care if we move block a couple things. They may be a very defensive type of list. My Space Marine opponents, for example, sometimes don't care if I move block them because they're not going to move anyway. And they're just going to pick up the Warp Spider squad for free. They don't want to go into the midboard yet because it's turn 1. And they have no reason to because they didn't draw secondaries that required them to get into the middle of the board. So that's the other thing I want to bring up, is that counting your opponent's secondaries is extremely important, not only to winning the game, but understanding how the army works at its core and how to play the army throughout the game. Now, every Eldari army should be able to score pretty much any objective that's not a kill type of objective on any given turn. That's pretty much a given, right? You need to be able to do that, and we do have the tools to do this. We are a very fast army, and again, we're a very unconventional army, but we do have to create those situations ahead of time. And many of these moments actually come from being able to assess which secondary cards are left in your opponent's deck. So, for example, let's say by turn 2, your opponent has drawn all of their, storm hostile objective, overwhelming force, and extend enemy battle lines. They've scored all the kind of, or at least most of the objectives that require them to either kill units on objectives or get onto an objective. Right? That gives you a lot of information about how the rest of the game has to be played. Because you now know what units they have to use to score those other objectives later in the game. So, for example, they might get Establish Locus. What do you have to do for Establish Locus? Well, you either have to get in the enemy deployment zone, or you have to get in the middle of the field. Now, you do not have to, control the objective in the middle for that specific one, but it is only 2 points if you get to the middle. That might be something that you can let go, right? You can give your opponent 2 points, but you don't want to give them the 4 points for being in your deployment zone, so that's something you have to protect. On the other hand, if they draw something like Sabotage, you can position yourself in such a way that all of the pieces of terrain in the middle of the battlefield are within threat range of your units, even if it's not a quote-unquote good trade. Let me give you an example. What I like to use Howling Banshees for is objectives that require you to kill something to score, either by killing something and then controlling an objective at the end of your turn, or preventing your opponent from scoring by killing their Sabotage unit. Now, you might be thinking, Proxy Hammer, what are you talking about with the Howling Banshees, right? Because Howling Banshees aren't good against every target. Remember, they're a very precise damage unit. They're really only good at killing not light infantry, but heavy infantry, but typically just Marines, right? Well, actually, what I've found is that in a lot of games, opponents want to use cheap units that aren't that durable to score objectives. And that means Sabotage as well. Yes, you could Sabotage with a Rhino, but of course, if you Sabotage with a Rhino, then there's nothing you can really do about it as an Eldari player unless you're willing to make a big sacrifice, make a big trade, right? If it's behind line of sight blocking terrain, there's not much you can do. There's not a lot of units in an Eldari army that can deal with that. On the other hand, if your opponent selects anything else, any kind of infantry unit, then you can easily stop the sabotage from happening. And I would actually argue in some cases it's not completely impossible to kill a rhino. Like, for example, if you have something like an Autarch Wayleaper with Warp Spiders, if you have Lycus, right, both of those units can kill a rhino because they have lethal hits. Lycus's unit crits on fives. An Autarch has a Dragon's Fusion Gun that can, move its hit roll or wound roll to a 6, which is extremely powerful, right? And use a free grenade because you can use a free stratagem. So there are ways of killing that kind of thing. Will they always be relevant in every game? No. But the fact that you are able to potentially score that or prevent your opponent from scoring it means that you have something to answer it. So again, that's something you should be thinking about during your game. Now, lastly, you should also be thinking about not only the units that will be needed to score those objectives your opponent might draw, but where they will have to move to. And of course, the overall board state, right? Now, one of the things that your opponent might have to do is they might have to move into the midboard. Maybe they get something like Display of Might. Display of Might is a good number of secondary points. Oftentimes, your opponent is not going to be able to just ignore it. So, your opponent may actually have to move several units into the midboard. And here's the thing, if they draw it by turn 3 and you have a unit in Deep Strike that can rapid ingress, you can actually force your opponent to move an additional unit into the midboard because they know that you could easily slip a unit into the midboard yourself. And because we're Eldar, we do have a lot of reactive type moves. So potentially we could move a unit that wasn't in the midboard into the midboard because we have things like Fade Back, or we have things like the Ranger reactive move that we can utilize to our advantage. So these are all things that you need to consider when playing the Aeldari. And again, this kind of goes into the Aeldari being not only an army of opportunity, being opportunistic, but also being able to, kind of see what your opponent has already drawn for secondaries and make plans based on that. Lastly, move block and screen to deny opportunities and prevent your opponent from scoring and getting good line of sight lanes as well. This is something that Aeldari also excel at because we have a lot of fast units. We have units like Warp Spiders who can move 24 inches plus. We have units like Swooping Hawks who can move base 14 and then advance and possibly use a token if they don't want to get overwatched, right? So they also have assault weapons, of course, and have grenades. So we can do a little bit of damage while moving into a position to deny our opponent something, right? Like, for example, let's say turn 2, our opponent has not drawn extend enemy battle lines. They have not drawn, secondaries that require them to get on middle objectives. Well, chances are, guys, that within, a couple turns, turn 3, turn 4, they're going to have units that are in a position to get onto objectives and to score those secondaries. Ways that we can prevent them from scoring these is move blocking, right? So in the first couple turns of the game, you don't really have a ton of recourse on what your opponent can and can't score outside of just not putting units on objectives, right? So if you don't want your opponent to score overwhelming force or storm hostile objective during the first couple turns of the game, the only thing you can realistically do is keep your units off objectives. But after turn, 2, you go on to turn 3, turn 4, you can move block your opponent and prevent them totally from getting on those objectives. And by that time, you should have already picked off some units in your opponent's army and made this a little bit harder, right? Of course, again, it depends on the matchup, but if your opponent is running a more elite force, this is where the Aeldari really shine because we can stretch their resources to the point where they can't score their secondaries well. Yes, they will probably score their primary just fine, right? They're going to score their home objective in a lot of different missions, and they might be able to score their expansion a lot. And maybe even one more, because a lot of armies have tough units out there, right? Necrons have Canoptic Wraiths. If we were talking about custodies, they have wardens and Alaris custodians, right? Those big Terminator guys. There's a lot of things to consider in the primary game, but where the Eldar really shine, even if they can't do enough damage to totally wipe out a big Death Star unit like a Dark Angel Deathwing Knight squad, where they shine is being able to prevent secondaries from potentially being scored. Now, once an opponent is on an objective, unfortunately, it's kind of too late at that point. So, when you do move block, make sure you have enough resources in your bank of resources. You have enough unit depth to be able to block for multiple turns. These are all ways in which the Aeldari can, basically dominate the opponent in one aspect of the game or another. Okay, now lastly, I feel like we have to talk about the quote unquote eternal curse of the Aeldari. And that is that as Aeldari players, we have to play better than our opponents, and I'll define what better means in just a second, to win the game. And in exchange, right, because that obviously is true, Aeldari do require a higher level of gaming skill, quote unquote, than what other factions might be. We are given unique tools that allow us to do so and to make those opportunities happen. So, the weaknesses of the Aeldari are that they are extremely fragile, right? Extremely fragile, and their damage is very precise. They're not a sledgehammer, right? Certain units are effective against certain enemy types. And outside of those enemy types, you can have a situation where you're really, really effective against a certain type of unit and really, really ineffective against another. A great example of this, in my opinion, is Dark Reapers. Dark Reapers are one of those units that are very effective against light vehicles. They're also very effective against heavy infantry. What they're not really good at doing is killing hordes, because despite popular belief, their Reaper launchers only get 2 shots apiece. So they're really not good at clearing out hordes, unless you have a ton of Dark Reapers. So, quick example, if you're shooting at a big squad of 20 with a squad of 5 Dark Reapers, maybe 20 guardsmen or something like that, a 95-point squad of Dark Reapers will not even kill their points worth of guardsmen in a single shooting phase. What this means is that oftentimes this will mean that the Dark Reapers are dead next turn. So, even with a missile launcher, by the way, you're just probably not killing enough, right? You have 8 attacks, you're hitting on 3s, probably 5 hit out of that. Maybe you get lucky and roll a 1 and, you re-roll it into a hit. So, and that's just an aspect host, by the way. Maybe you get 6 hits, you're wounding on 3s, you get 4 wounds. The guardsmen don't get a save against it, but you're only killing 4 guardsmen there, right? On average dice, the blast version of the missile launcher also isn't killing that many. So you might kill 6, you might kill 7 guardsmen, right? That's not great for the cost. So again, Dark Reapers, are they good against hordes? Well, not really, unless you take a ton of Tempest launchers and you're all shooting at the same target. But then again, it's still not that much, because Tempest launcher has AP1, but it doesn't ignore cover. So there's still a weakness there a little bit. So miscalculations in damage, missed opportunities with either denying or scoring secondaries, or non-perfect positioning. And again, I'll explain what this means in a second. But all of these things will lead to defeat against competent opponents of your skill level. Now, if you're an Aeldari player and you're much more skilled than your opponent, you might be able to make a couple mistakes and still win, but that doesn't mean that you didn't make those mistakes and they didn't prevent you from scoring big points. I've gone against opponents that are less skilled than I am as a player, but I have made mistakes that have cost me secondary victory points, and they cost me my total score. Now, this won't matter for a number of games. Like in a casual setting, it doesn't matter too much. If you win, you win. It doesn't matter by 1 point or by 20 points, right? But in a tournament setting, this can actually make a big difference, right? Not being able to score a secondary that you should have planned for a couple turns beforehand can make the difference in a podium placement, right? Even if you win all your games, it can still make a difference. So those missed opportunities, right? For getting, perfect example, right? If you're playing a Warhost list and you know that some of the secondaries in your deck require you to be on certain places in the board to score objectives, and let's say you don't use your stratagem to pull a unit, uppy downy a unit that's on a board edge with Webway Portal, you might find yourself at a severe disadvantage. You might not be able to do that. Or you might have to use a unit that is more valuable than what you wanted to use for that specific secondary, which can have a big effect because Eldari are kind of expensive. Now, yes, they have affordable units, but those units are small and very fragile. Also, not positioning correctly, that can be big because if your opponent can draw a line of sight on something, it's usually dead. So if you're, not perfect with your placement, now I have played many a game with people that I tell them my intentions. Hey, my intentions are to hide this here. And do you think you can see me? Is there any angles that you can see me from? My opponent has said, no, I don't think so. And then we go to the turn and my opponent, figures out, oh, actually, yes, there is an angle right here. But if you move your model over like a hair, it's not going to be in line of sight. Do you want to do that? Because you did state your intention. And I'll say something like, yeah, I apologize. Models move, terrain moves, models are nudged around. We get it. But some players at a tournament will not allow this. They will not give you the benefit of the doubt, right? And I've talked to many of them that just won't do it. Now, that's within their rights, right? That's within their rights to do. There is nothing saying that you have to play with intent. It is polite in a lot of cases to do this, but some players I could see take advantage of this, right? Like, tournament players can sometimes be a little sharkish. So, in a tournament setting, you kind of have to be perfect with your Eldar positioning, or you might find yourself in a really bad place. It might not matter to a Marine player or a faction that is a little bit more conventional in 40k because they have tougher units. They're able to, all right, you can see me with 5 scouts. That's not a big deal. I might lose a couple Necron warriors. Big deal. For Eldar, you might lose the whole aspect warrior squad. It's a big difference, right? So that's what I mean by non-perfect positioning. Now, what I meant by we have to play better than our opponents to win the game, I just mean that we have to follow up on opportunities more often, and we have to think about not only our own secondaries, but often our opponent's secondaries throughout the game. Because the Eldari do not score well on primary, we are a secondary army. A lot of my victories come from just being able to deny secondaries from my opponents. And when I do make mistakes, I realize that most of my mistakes center around not being able to prevent a certain secondary objective that my opponent draws, right? Not having the foresight to be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have put my unit on this objective. Maybe I shouldn't have consolidated onto this objective because I knew that they still had overwhelming force in the bank. Maybe I should have just stayed put and not consolidated back onto an objective, knowing that they can score secondary off of it, and also knowing that that unit was probably going to die regardless and not survive long enough for me to score a primary off of it. Those are the other things that you have to think about as an Eldar player that other armies don't have to think about that much. Because basically, if I have a really tough unit on an objective, I have a good chance of surviving with something and scoring some primary, or surviving with something and denying my opponent their secondary objective, which is overwhelming force, right? A canoptic raid squad, for example, has a good chance of surviving on an objective. So if you get the opportunity to consolidate back onto it, oftentimes you will. An Eldari player, oftentimes, if your opponent has secondaries still left in the deck that require them to kill units on objectives, an Eldari player has a real hard decision to make. And oftentimes the better move is just not consolidating back onto the objective, unless you have a secondary that requires it. Now, having said that, when good Eldari players defeat players using another faction, whether they're just as competent as that player or they are more competent than that player, any faction that plays with few to no mistakes often gives the impression that the Eldari are overpowered, right? When you look at somebody like Liam VSL play the Eldari, you see somebody who plays with very little mistakes. And oftentimes, a lot of people are like, this guy's a savant. I've said it myself. This guy's an absolute savant. The reason he's able to score so many points in games is because he's able to position his units perfectly. He doesn't miss any opportunities. He knows exactly where his models are going to be turns in advance. And he doesn't miscalculate typically, right? There, of course, are some matchups that even the best players have issues with because of certain rules, interactions, and so forth. But for the most part, he knows his army so well that it can score very highly in most scenarios. And again, when you watch a player do that, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that that faction is OP, right? The opponent stood no chance. But in fact, it's just because the Eldari player was so precise that it looked like child's play, when often it isn't. So, to beat a good Eldari player, one must be aware of what they can do. One must practice against the Eldari a couple times. It's not an army that you can just casually play every once in a while, not know what they do, and expect to beat a skilled player, right? Like, for example, if nobody had ever fought against Eldari before, and they go against me, and they're a competent player, let's say they're a good player, and they go against me, but they've never played against Eldari before, they're probably not going to win. They're probably not going to win, especially if they have an army that I'm aware of, right? That I know how to play against. We could be of equal skill as players, but if my opponent doesn't have a working knowledge of the Eldari, then they're not going to be aware of the things that I can generally do. Even if I tell them before the game all my stratagems and stuff, the positioning, where they can go on the battlefield and stuff like that are things that my opponent may well miscalculate. So not only do you have to be aware of it, but you also have to be able to devise strategies to stop them. You have to do a little bit of homework before you can expect to defeat a really good Eldari player, because Eldari are not a very common army. Now, weirdly enough, they are becoming more common in competitive play because they're a very dynamic army. We have a lot of new models. We just got a bunch of new models. A lot of people are excited to use the Eldari because they're a fun faction to play. They have a lot of cool different rules. They have unique units. By the way, a lot of people, believe it or not, I know this is going to come as a shock to some of you, but a lot of people like armies that are unique and special. And Eldari have a lot of specialized units, and those things are fun. Going up against an Eldari army is a very different experience, but they can be stopped. I've played the Eldari mirror many times. I've played Dark Eldar versus Eldar. I've even played Space Marines against Eldari. And I've played against pretty good players. I've played against people who go to tournaments on a semi-regular basis with Space Marines. By the way, Space Marines an army I don't really like, and I don't have a lot of passion for. But I've played them to give them practice, and I've done quite well. And that is not a brag for my part. I'm saying that if you know how to play against the Eldari, you will be able to do much better against them than you think. You just need to do a little bit of studying. So anybody out there listening to this video and thinking, oh God, Eldar are so OP. I'm so glad that they're going to get nerfed in the next balance. They just which they probably will get nerfed a little bit, or maybe a lot. We'll see what GW decides. I don't think they deserve a huge nerf, but there's ways to beat Eldari. You just have to think about it a little bit. You have to devise strategies against it. You have to put your mind to work. That's just like any faction, right? If we look at, for example, I don't know, the Adeptus Mechanicus. Adeptus Mechanicus are really strong right now. But to beat them, you're going to have to put your nose to the grindstone a little bit and figure out a way. You're going to have to look at their rules, look at how the interactions are, go through the steps and the paces, and figure out how to beat them. They're actually a really hard matchup for the Aeldari because they have a lot of the same tools the Aeldari have, but they're much cheaper. Now, what the cheapness gives them is, a little bit of, worse stats. So, in general, Adeptus Mechanicus have worse stats, but the Aeldari are so fragile, this often doesn't matter. So Adeptus Mechanicus is a hard matchup. But as an Aeldari player myself, I can say that the Adeptus Mechanicus aren't unbeatable unless there's some severe circumstances, either in the mission or in the army matchup, right? And one last thing I want to leave you guys with is remember when we were talking about, kind of circumventing expectations with what units are good and what detachment. For example, in Warhost, we often don't see units like Shroud Runners, but Shroud Runners are actually really good in Warhost because not only do they have a really powerful scout move, but they have sustained hits on their weapons. So if you want to move block with a unit of Shroud Runners and also just murder a squad of scouts or just murder, some light infantry that is, infiltrating or whatever, you can do that because you have a lot of speed with your Shroud Runners and you have that stratagem that gives them 5+ crits on sustained hits. So they can actually generate a lot of damage. And again, this is a unit that a lot of people do not take. People do not like Shroud Runners, but I believe that Shroud Runners are very good. Also, they ignore cover, right? Whatever they hit, they get rid of the cover from, which is very powerful. So anyway, and there's a lot of army builds as well that are successful. I've talked to many people on the channel who have unconventional builds. I've talked to, Mike, for example, from Malta. He always, kind of comments on some of my videos and stuff. He's an awesome dude. I've had interviews with him. He played Guardian Battle Host during the time where Knights were super OP, and he absolutely wrecked Knights by taking D cannons with Guardians in Guardian Battle Host and playing that kind of game. That was very successful. A lot of people were saying support weapons suck. Don't take support weapons, especially at that time, right? People were saying, oh, if you don't have fire dragons, you're never going to be knights. And he did, because he subverted expectations and he was able to do, some kind of research on how to win without fire dragons. So I guess the lesson here is that a lot of players have a certain way of thinking that, and that's kind of like the only way they think the Aeldari should be, or this detachment should be, or, because the best players in the world are playing it this way, that means that that's the only good way. When actually, there's a lot of different ways to play the Aeldari. And actually, there's, quite a few players that went to Worlds that played slightly different things. Somebody brought the Avatar of Cain, right? There were some outliers, and they actually did quite well. So, moral of the story here, don't always, lock yourself in your own mind when it comes to the things that, we kind of traditionally think or conventionally think about army building or detachments. Release yourself from that. Try new things. I've had a lot of success with weird stuff as well. I've run a squad of Shining Spears in my aspect host, and usually they don't do anything, but I've recently figured out the key to successfully running a squad of Shroudrunners in your list, and it actually has to do not so much with, just being able to do raw damage to something, but using their OC in a way that provides you with objective control at the same time as being able to threaten something else on another objective because you can move through walls. So that's something that I missed earlier, but I have found is very helpful. Putting them on an expansion objective near some Howling Banshees that have fights first is awesome because it gives them a lot of reach into your opponent's deployment zone, and they're protected from their main threats, which are, of course, being charged or being shot at because they're going to be behind terrain. And this is not how I was using them before. I was using them as like a bullet to send into something, but that's not always the best way to use them, right? Okay, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think about this general idea. I think if we kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit and come up with some just insane stuff, just throw stuff against a wall, we can kind of get over these conventional ways of thinking. We can create something really great. And especially since we're coming to the point where we're going to see if we get nerfed or not. And Aspect Host and War Host might be taking some big nerfs, so we're going to have to think about how we can circumvent that and still do what Eldar do best, which is unconventional warfare. And of course, being able to, create opportunities for ourselves that can score us big in the game. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching once again. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters for supporting me throughout the years. I really appreciate it. If you do want to join the Patreon and support the channel and what I'm doing here, I will leave the link in the description. Of course, if you support, you're always welcome to message me about ideas, or, if you want help with something, I'm more than happy to do so. Lastly, if you do sign up for my Patreon, even if it's for free membership, by the way, I do have free members on the Patreon. You just have to sign up for a free membership. You will get access to our Discord community, which is a huge community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. And I think the most important thing about this, I know there's an Aeldari server out there, but our server, the Proxy Hammer server, is toxic free. And, well, I think it's toxic free. We haven't had a problem in a very long time. So if you want to go ahead and join up, talk to me, talk to other cool Aeldari players, join on in. Love to see you there. Lastly, I do have a channel store page and an Amazon affiliate link. Check those out in the description if you want some Eldar inspired apparel or some discounted Eldar minis. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today. Peace out, and I'll see you guys next time.